All right, Rabbi, we'll say good morning. We have an exciting daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Tzadik Beis. Begin by thanking this morning's sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors, Yoel and Sarah Kelman, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashas this month of Cheshvan, in incredible appreciation to the Kehillah for all of the shiurim, drashas, and learning opportunities. We dedicate our learning and the zechus of refuah shlema for Ruchama Aviva Bas Sheinachana, as well as for Rachel Yehudis Bas Tova Gittel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, these two precious women, together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, should have a complete and enduring refuah. But with that, let us begin. So we're going to finish out the sugya today from the last Mishnah. We actually have a very nice Shulchan Aruch to look at today as well, Amir Hashem, and then go on to a new sugya. So we'll say today's daf is Tzadik Beis 92. Less than 2 weeks away from the completion of Eruvin Daf. Less than 2 weeks. Pretty incredible. Last line of Tzadik Aleph, Amud Aleph, is where we left off. Amar li Ravina Ravashi. So Ravina said to Ravashi. So the Gemara says, Amar li Ravina Ravashi. Mi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Hachi. Did Rabbi Yochanan actually say this? So we'll say, what is the say this? So we'll say, if you remember again, we had towards the middle of Tzadik Aleph Amud Aleph yesterday a very important machlokes. So we'll say, first of all, we had a couple of breakthroughs yesterday. Breakthrough number one was the Gemara telling us that the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon, namely that gagos, chatzeros, karfifos are all considered to be one rishus for utensils which were left in any of those respective rishuyos. So you leave a kli, you left the utensil outside, or it doesn't have to be a kli, you used to muktzah, right? If you go ahead and you leave something out in your chutzner, so you can go ahead and carry that from chutzner to chutzner. Oh, again, I will say, as was pointed out, remember when we say chutzner to chutzner, assuming the chatzeros are next to each other, right? Chutzner to gag, gag to karfef, so on and so forth. We had a machlokes Shmuel and Rav and Shmuel about the parameters of that statement that the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon. So we'll say, so Rav said, the halacha only follows Rabbi Shimon when an Eruv Chatzeros wasn't made. Because if an Eruv Chatzeros was made, what are we concerned about? People, because there's an Eruv, what's going to happen? People now have the license to bring utensils from their home into the Chatzer, and we're concerned that they're going to take those utensils and move them from the Chatzer to the Chatzer, from the Chatzer to the Gag, from the Gag to the Karkev, so on and so forth, and that's not mutter. Because even Rabbi Shimon only allows you to move utensils which were outside of the home at the beginning of Shabbos. Shmuel says, no, not true. Not true. The halacha follows Rabbi Shimon whether you made an Eruv, didn't make an Eruv. What about the concern that you may come to go ahead and move a utensil that started Shabbos in the house? And we'll say, what's the answer? The answer is, be careful. The answer is, be careful. Right? There's a level of personal responsibility. Yes, so it's quite possible you'll have a case where you have two utensils sitting in your chutzner. One you can move to another chutzner, to a gag, to a karfef, and one you cannot. And the achrayus is upon you to remember, ultimately again, which utensil can be moved and which cannot. Good. I will say, Rabbi Yochanan came along and he agreed with Shmuel, namely that the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon even in a case where you made an Eruv. Fine. That's where our Gemara picks up now. Umi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Haki, top of Tzadik Beis. Does Rabbi Yochanan actually say that the halacha follows Shmuel? Namely, the halacha follows Shmuel, namely that the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon even in a case where you made an Eruv Chatzeros. So the Gemara says, V'ha Am Rabbi Yochanan halacha kistam Mishnah. Also, Rabbi Yochanan always says the halacha follows the Stam Mishnah. What happened in the Stam Mishnah? So the Gemara says, and we learn the following. Kosel shebein shtei chatzeros gavoa savarach avarba. If you have a wall in between two chatzeros and it's 10 tfachim high and 4 tfachim wide, so we'll say, what does that do to the two chatzeros? You know this already. Ma'arvin shtein ve'ma'arvin echad. So we'll say, first of all, if you have a wall that height and that thickness, by definition, that divides the two chatzeros, and they cannot make a joint eruv. Hayu barosho peros. We'll say if there was some fruit on the top of the wall. Elu olin mikan va'ochlin ve'elu olin mikan ochlin. So we'll say, interestingly enough, remember, everyone has the right to go to the top of the wall and to enjoy the fruit. However, we'll say, what can't you do? You can't go ahead and bring the fruit down. Right? You can't bring the fruit down from the top of the wall into the respective chatzeros. Right now, we'll say, what do you see from here? Look at Rashi. Alma asula hotzi michatzer lechaverta. So we'll say, remember again, what does that mean? Because Lamaisa, you can't carry from one chatzer to the other. Remember, we'll say, when the wall is 10 tefachim wide, 4 tefachim wide. Essentially, both chatzeros have dominion over the wall, right? The fruit's on the top of the wall, so you could go up to the top of the wall and eat the fruit there, but you can't bring the fruit down to either of the chatzeros, which I will say tells you what? That effectively, you cannot carry fruit from one chatzer to another. Now finish Rashi. I amrit bishlama be'ervu asaru kimna laha be'eruvo. Aval hashta b'mai tukma. So we'll say, Rashi is going to say in just a moment, Rashi is going to say, well, let's read the Gemara. So what do we say? So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. So Rashi, I'm sorry, let's finish Rashi. So Rashi says, if you understand that it's a case ultimately again of where they made an Eruv, then Abosai, I understand the Isser. So Abosai, so this would seem to contradict Rabbi Yochanan's point, because Rabbi Yochanan says that the din follows Rabbi Shimon, even in a case where they made an Eruv, but this would seem to go against that assertion, to which the Gemara says, no. My lamata, what does it mean ultimately? Again, you can't bring it down. Lamata labatim. Abosai, what it means is you can bring the fruit down from the top of the wall into the respective chatzeros, like Rabbi Shimon, or like Shmuel's interpretation, Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of Rabbi Shimon. But Lamaisa, what can't you do? You can't bring the fruit down from the top of the wall into the homes. I see the Gemara says, I have a hatani Rabbi Chia, ubilvat shelo yehe zeh omed bimkomo va'ochel, v'zeh omed bimkomo va'ochel. But I will say in Rabbi Chia's version, right, the lashon he has is that you could go to the top of the wall and eat the fruit, but you can't bring the fruit down to each of the respective chatzeros, so that everybody will be eating the fruit bimkomo. Then I will say we assume bimkomo means what? In his chatzer. Look at Rashi. Shelo yehezeh omed bimkomo bekarkois chatzer. Right, that neither could bring the fruit from the top of the wall, ultimately again, to the actual chatzar. Lishnachrina shezim. We're supposed to listen to this. So what the Gemara is suggesting over here is Rabbi Chia's version. In Rabbi Chia's version, it explicitly says that what? That you cannot bring fruit from the top of the wall into the chatzar. Now Rabbi say, understand something. If Rabbi Yochanan really holds like Shmuel's interpretation of Rabbi Shimon, then the halacha is you should allow for the transfer of the fruit from the top of the wall into the chatzar, because that is no different than going ahead and transferring fruit from one chatzar to another. According to Rabbi Shimon, as long as what? As long as that fruit began Shabbos where? On the wall, in the chatzar, there should be no problem. Yet the Brisa seems to clearly indicate to us, or the Mishnah, sees that you can't transfer fruits from the top of the wall to the chatzar. So I will say, so remember, so first the Gemara tries to say, no. What does it mean you can't transfer the wall from the top of the wall lamata? Lamata means into the homes. You can't transfer the fruits from the top of the wall into the homes. Okay, fair. The problem just is, in Rabbi Chia's version, Rabbi Chia is even more explicit. Rabbi Chia says explicitly, you can't take fruit from the top of the wall and eat it, omed bimkomo. You can't take it from the wall and eat it where you are. Now, where you are, the Gemara understands pretty much means into the chatzar. So you have Rabbi Chia's version pretty explicitly saying that halacha l'maisa, you can't go ahead and take fruits from the top of the wall into the chatzar. Then I both say, how would you explain that case? The Pashas would explain that case is where Erev Chatzeros was made. And even with the Erev Chatzeros that was made, ultimately, so that would therefore go against Rabbi Yochanan's view of, or I should say, Rabbi Yochanan's reliance on Shmuel's interpretation of Rabbi Shimon. To which the Gemara says, but I don't understand. V'chi Rabbi lo shana, Rabbi Chia minayino. So we'll say, so interesting enough, the Gemara says, since Rebbe did not include this phrase in the codification of the Mishnah, where does Rabbi Chia get it from? They will say Rabbi Chia was the Talmud of Rebbe. Since Rebbe did not include this verbiage in the inclusion of the Mishnah, so where does Rabbi Chia kind of come off saying it? So essentially what the Gemara says is, that's not what the Mishnah says. Right? The lashon of the Mishnah is simply, ubilvad shelo yoridu lemata. It doesn't say Rabbi Chia's interpretation of ochel bimkomo. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says v'chi Rabbi lo shana lemishnah zu b'mishnah seinu. Rabbi did not include this phrase in our Mishnah. Rabbi Chia shesider v'sasam es habraisa v'talmido haya. So Rabbi Chia was the Talmud of Rabbi. Rabbi codified the Mishnayos. Rabbi Chia codified the Braisos. So if Rabbi did include it in the Mishnah, what right does Rabbi Chia have to introduce this type of verbiage? Fine. So we'll say, so therefore again, the challenge that the Gemara tried to bring to Rabbi Yochanan's position did not work. So Itmar, Shtei chatzeros v'chorva achas benehem. So we'll say, here we go. You have two chatzeros, and there is a ruin in between them. Okay, so we'll say, so this is picture, just if you want to say, this is picture 324. Pretty simple idea. Chorva means, we'll also remember again, a ruin. So the two chatzeros and one ruin in between them. Achas irva va'achas lo irva. Now we'll say, now in this case over here, one of the chatzeros made an eruv chatzeros, and one did not. So we'll say, so just to be clear, they did not make an eruv with each other. So you have chatzer A, chatzer B, and in the middle of chatzer A and chatzer B is a chorva. Now Rashi happens to point out, all right, we don't have to get into it. So I'll say, so chatzer A made its own eruv chatzeros. Now both say, now what that means is, therefore obviously chatzer A has the ability to go out and carry utensils between the home and the chatzer. So we'll say, what happens over here? So we'll say, Amar Rav Huna, Nosnin osa lezu shelo erva. This is fascinating. Rav Huna says, we give the use of the churva to chatzer B, which did not make an eruv chatzeros. Aval she'erva lo, but we deny chatzer A use of the churva. Remember again, chatzer A made eruv chatzeros. We deny use of the churva to chatzer A. We'll say, now why is that? Why? Dilma asi lafuke mani debatam l'chorva. Because we'll say, what are we concerned about? We're concerned that because chatzer has an eruv chatzeros, and you carry utensils from the home into the chatzer, what's going to end up happening? Chatzer A may inadvertently come to carry utensils from their chatzer into the churva, which of course would be problematic. So I just want to point out how fascinating this is, that ultimately up until yesterday's daf, we always assumed that creation of an eruv always puts you at an advantage. And now it is quite fascinating to see that under certain very unique circumstances, the creation of an eruv actually could potentially be limiting. So here you have, this is a fantastic case. So you have again, chatzer A made an eruv chatzeros, yet it's that very eruv chatzeros which will preclude it from using the churva out of concern that you may come. Now, boss, and I want to point out, remember, technically speaking, utensils that began Shabbos in chatzer A, what's their status? According, if we pass like Rabbi Shimon, they could be moved between the chatzer and the churva. That's no problem. The concern is utensils that began Shabbos in the home. Those cannot be moved. Technically, because you have an eruv, you can move them out into the chatzer, but you can't move them out into the eruv. That's where the concern comes up. Now that you have the ability to move utensils from your home into your chatzer, we're concerned you're going to take it from the home to the chatzer into the churva, and that's going to be illegal. Therefore, again, Rav Huna says that halacha, in order to take away that concern, we simply tell chatzer A, shkoyach in your eruv chatzeros, you cannot use the churva. Chatzer B, you could use the churva. Now remember, I will say chatzer B's use of the churva is for what? For utensils which began Shabbos inside the chatzer of chatzer B. Then you can move those utensils between the chatzer and the churva. So the Gemara says, V'chiyah barav Amar, Chiyah barav says, no, af l'she'irva. Ultimately, again, so Chiyah barav says that halacha l'maisa, we go ahead and we give the rights. We give the rights of the churva, even to the chatzer that did not make the eruv, i.e. chatzer B, and therefore shtei and asuras. Therefore, we'll say both of them will be restricted. Both of them will be restricted. So the Gemara says, Ve'im tomar shtehen mutaros, and why don't you say both of them should be mutar? Mipnei ma'i nosnin chatzer shelo irva lechatzer she'irva. So we'll say, I don't understand. Let's go back for just 1 second. So Chiyah barav comes along, and Chiyah barav says that halacha l'maisa, he disagrees. Rav Huna wants to suggest that the churva is only given to chatzer B, which didn't make the eruv chatzeros, and not to chatzer A. Chiyah barav says we're going to give it even to chatzer A. I will say, what does it mean if you give it even to chatzer A? That means ultimately, again, shtehen asuros. Ultimately, again, both of them will be asur. I'll say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. So Rashi says over, Chiyah barav, Amar af l'she'irva, ani shamati me'abba af l'she'irva nosinosa, umidaiti ani mefarish, dahaydo Amar abba af l'she'irva, le'esor eshteim ka'amar, the gazer lo irva atu irva, the mafki hani lagava hani nami asu mafki. So we'll see that come out in just a moment in the Gemara. But Chiyah barav says we give the churva to both of them, but effectively by giving it to both of them, the churva also becomes prohibited to both of them. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Vim tomar shtehen mutaros, but I don't understand why should that be that both of them are prohibited? Why not say that both of them are permitted to use the churva? So let's take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Vim Tomar, that's quite interesting. So b'masha shamati af l'she'irva lahatir ka'amar Abba, the shtei mutaros, v'lo gazer Abba be'irva mishum mani debatim, kashim also, the Abba do amar le'el halach Reb Shimon, v'ushalo irvu, aval irvu lo, mipnei ma'i nostin chatzah shelo irva lachatzah she'irva, tachnis keila l'so chaberta v'totziem. I don't understand, why is it, Avosai, that halacha l'maisa, by giving it to both of them, does the chorva become prohibited? Ultimately, again, why should it not become permitted? Why would we not give the use of a chatzar that has not made an eruv to the chatzar that has made an eruv? Hassam, here's the difference. Kivan demintri mani debatim b'chatzar asilafuke. Because I say ultimately, again, when you have a chatzar, which we presume is a walled area, so ultimately, again, it is common for people to take utensils out of their homes and place it into the chatzar because the chatzar is guarded. So we'll say once that happens, that's where there becomes a concern of then what? Taking those utensils which began Shabbos inside the home are now in the chatzar and ultimately moving them elsewhere. However, b'churva, kevan de lo minteri mani de chatzar b'churva lo asilafuki. But also when it comes to a churva, since ultimately again it's not guarded, we're not concerned that people are going to come to bring utensils there, and therefore again, that concern doesn't exist to as great a degree. Ikedan will say an alternate version of this. So the Ikedan Chia Barav Amar Afle She'irva. So Chia Barav said ultimately again we even give the churva to the chatzar that made the eruv. Ushtein mutaros. And both are mutter, both are permitted to go in and use the churva. So we'll say what that means is both chatzeros can take utensils which began Shabbos in their respective chatzeros and ultimately move it into the churva and back and forth from the churva to the chatzeros. I v'im tomar shtehen asuros. But why don't you say that both of them ultimately again should restrict each other? To which the Gemara says, "Lefi she'ein nostin chatzar shelo irva lechatzar she'irva." Because halacha l'maisa, we do not give the use of a chatzar that did not make an eruv to a chatzar that did make an eruv. The Gemara says, why is that? Hassam, kevan deminteri mani debatim chatzar. Because we'll say in that case over here, there's a real concern that one will come to move utensils from the home into the chatzar. Why? Because the chatzar is guarded. Therefore, lo shara b'hu rabbanan. Dasi lafuke. Because we'll say a person will come to take utensils out of their home and ultimately move it into the chatzar. Aval b'churva, but ultimately in a ruin, lo minteri. We'll say because a ruin is not guarded, therefore halacha l'maisa, the concern that a person will come to move utensils out or move utensils in there. The concern that a person will come to move utensils that are once into the home, into the churva, is not really so shaykh because the churva itself is not guarded. So fine. So we'll say so that ends the sugya. What about the resolution? So we'll say we have a number of open machloksim. So remember again, let's go through the machloksim now that we have to resolve. We had 3 machlokis in the Mishnah, right? Rabbi Meir, Chachamim, and Rabbi Shimon about the status of rooftops, right? Rabbi Meir Shita, all rooftops are one. Chachamim, except for the 10 tefach height differential. Chachamim Shita, that each rooftop is Rishus Liatzmo. Rabbi Shimon, Gagos, Chatzeros, Karfifos are considered to be one Rishus. Fast forward a little bit. Okay, so there are other machloksim also, like Rav and Shmuel and the Shita of Rabbi Meir, but we're gonna fast forward past that for just a moment. Yesterday we were told halacha is like Rabbi Shimon, Gagos, Chatzeros, Karfifos, one Rishus. We then spent the rest of yesterday and now half of today focusing on what? Halacha l'maisa, when does that apply? Machlokis Rav and Shmuel. So Rav telling me that it only applies when there is no eruv chatzeros, right? Because if there's an eruv chatzeros, we'll say, what's the concern? What's the concern? That you'll take utensils that were in the home and end up transferring them to these respective rishus, which is aser. Shmuel saying no, absolutely no problem. Even if you made the eruv, the halacha still follows Rabbi Shimon. So we'll say, how do we paskin? Because this is really incredibly important. So we'll say, we paskin the Shulchan Aruch. This is in Shin Ayin Beis Sif Aleph. Get ready for this. This is really incredible. Gagin chatzeros v'karfifos. Kulon rishus echad heim lekelim sheshav subesochan. What's incredible? We in fact do paskin like Rabbi Shimon. We paskin like Rabbi Shimon that gagos, chatzeros, karfifos are considered to be one rishus. Again, Abba says a very important qualifier. One rishus for what? Meaning you could carry utensils throughout all rishus, but what's the qualifier? the utensil must have started Shabbos in one of these domains. In other words, this does not apply to a utensil that began Shabbos inside your home, even if you had a license to bring it out into your chutzner. He goes on, he says, Shemutar l'taltula mizeh lazeh, afilu heim shel bailim harbe. So we'll say, remember again, we're talking about where the gagos, chatzeros, karfifos all belong to different people. All belong to different people. Nevertheless, as long as my kli began Shabbos in one of these domains, I could carry it to all of these other areas. V'lo irvu yachad, mutar l'taltel michatzer l'chatzer acheres, u'legag, or the rosh kosel shebineim, u'migag legag acher asamach la'afilu gavoa mimenu harbe. I could carry it from rooftop to rooftop, even what? Even if there is a significant height differential on the rooftop. So also, why does Shulchan Aruch add in that? Because remember, that's Rabbi Meir's whole thing. About 10 tafach differences, we don't hold like that. U'me'agag lekarfeif, so we'll say he then gives qualifications, ultimately, again, what type of karfeif this applies to. So fine. So number one, we pass like Rabbi Shimon. Gagos, chatzeros, karfifos are considered to be one rishos. So we'll say now the next thing we have to resolve is machlokes Rav and Shmuel. What about, again, does that din apply when they made an Eruv or didn't make an Eruv? Says the Shulchan Aruch, Va'af api she'ervu b'nei chatzar li'atzman, d'shchichi mani debatim b'chatzar, mutar l'taltal kelim sheshavsu b'chatzar zu, l'chatzar acheres, v'lo chayshinon shema yitaltel, gam kelim sheshavsu b'bayis l'chatzar acheres, o l'gago l'karfeif. And I will say, like Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, namely again, that the din follows Rabbi Shimon, even when you made an Eruv Chatzeros. And even when I might have been concerned that you're gonna end up taking utensils that were in the home into the Chatzer, and then using Rabbi Shimon's Shita to transfer the item from the Chatzer to the Gag, to the Karfek, to the this, to that. Ultimately, again, the Shulchan Aruch says, we are not concerned about that. We trust people. So again, I will say, so number one, halacha follows Rabbi Shimon, Gagos, Chatzeros, Karfifos are all considered to be one Rishus. Number two, halacha follows Shmuel's understanding of Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan's understanding of Rabbi Shimon, that Rabbi Shimon's Shita applies even when you made an Eruv Chatzeros. Dramatic, I will say. Again, I would urge you to take a look. Shin Ayin Beis Sif Aleph, a lot of interesting Mishnah Bruras on there as well. And also Ayin Sham, see inside over here, because the one part I'm not going into today is the Shulchan Aruch is mechalik between a different type of karfev. In other words, this doesn't just apply with any karfev because it's already in the sugya. There's in a karfev that is enclosed for residential use, more than 2 base saw, less than 2 base saw, but you'll see that inside. Good. But with that, let's go weiter. New Mishnah, Tzadik Beis Amud Aleph. Gag Godol Samach LeGag Katan. We'll say really interesting cases here. Suppose I have a big roof that is next to a small roof. Now what happens? So I'll say, this is pretty much, I mean, we've had this before. It's just to give you an idea, you know what, if you want, I don't know if anyone has any of the old pictures still, but this would be like picture 315. Yeah, good. You could see again. I will say it's you don't even need a picture. I will say so you have two buildings. One has a big roof. One has a small roof, right? So I will say obviously the image that's being painted over here is that the small roofed building on one side is totally open onto the larger roof. That's going to be the driving principle over here. So gag gadol samach legag katan. So I will say if you have a large roof that is next to a small roof, hagadol mutter. So we've seen this before already. The larger roof is mutter, v'akatan aser, and ultimately the small roof is aser. I'll say, let's go back for just a moment. Let's review. Why is the large roof mutter? Why? Remember? Why? Good asik, right? So let's remember again. What does good asik say? The sides of the walls go up. So remember, the godless over here is that the large roof has enclosures on all sides, because even on the side where the small roof opens up into it, there's what the Gemara called the gefufim, right? There's the sides. So therefore it has good asik on all 4 sides of it. Now I will say a very important qualifier here. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Agadol motor, lahachnis lo klei abayis shel matar. And I will say, now I want to point out over here, something Rashi points out, whereas the previous discussion about rooftops was focused on carrying from the rooftop to the rooftop, here we're switching gears a little bit to focusing on carrying from the home to the rooftop. That's the discussion over here. So Rashi says over here, Gadol mutar lahachnis lo klei abayis shalamata. You could bring utensils from the home below to the roof on top. Vein b'nei hakatan osrin alov. And the presence of the smaller roof does not asr the larger roof. And Rashi goes on, he says, the legabe gadol hach pirtza pesach udishari begifufe kigon de'ein ha pirtza yosem eser. I will say, very important qualifier. The only way the fourth roof is considered to be enclosed is as follows. Now remember, on three sides, good asik gives each side a full mechitza. On the fourth side, which we'll call the fourth side, which is the side where it opens up into the small roof, it only has the gifuf and has like what we'll call the side posts. So we'll say, as long as the area that opens up into the small roof is not more than 10 amis, then we view that as a doorway, as a Pesach. If it's more than 10 amis, then einach inami, what that does is, it's a pirtze, it's a breach, and therefore the large roof would consider it to be fully opened on one side as well, which would preclude you from carrying on that large roof. Rashi goes on, says, I will say, but obviously the small roof, you can't carry from the home to the roof. Why not? Because the small roof is totally breached on one side. Totally breached, right? The side where it opens up into the large roof is totally breached. V'divrei akolhu ta'afilu Rabbi Meir lo amar gagin rishus achos ela lekelim sheshavsu b'sochon aval lekelim sheshavsu bebatim lo dumi dechatzukan. So remember again, very important. Even Rabbi Meir, who says that all rooftops are considered to be one domain, will say that's if what? That's for utensils which began Shabbos on the rooftop. But if the utensils did not begin Shabbos on the rooftop, but instead the utensils are where inside the home, then einach inami, there's restricted mobility. So therefore, again, I will say, very simple. We learned this before. Small roof opens up into a larger roof. The larger roof is considered to be totally enclosed, good asik, even on the fourth side where it opens up into the small roof, as long as the quote-unquote opening is not more than 10 amas, large roof is fully enclosed. Conversely, small roof is totally open on one side, which negates the enclosure, which therefore tells you cannot take utensils from the home and bring it up to the roof. Good. Next. Chatzar gidol shenifritza l'ktana. So I'll say, what happens again if you have a large chatzar which opens up into a small chatzar? Now, we'll say, we're going to see why you need both of these cases. But again, this is picture 325. So picture 325, it's the same idea as the roof. It's just instead of talking about roofs, talking about chatzeros. You have a large roof, a large chatzar which opens up into a small chatzar. So what's the halacha? Gidola muteres, the large chatzar is muter. Then I will say here you can see the illustration because the large chatzar has full walls on three sides, and ultimately again on the fourth side it has the gifufim, right? It has the partials, right? The partial walls over there. And as long as that opening to the small chatzar is not more than 10 amis, it's viewed as a doorway. The large chatzar is fully enclosed. Conversely, the small chatzar is fully breached on one side, totally open, and therefore, again, you can't carry inside of that chatzar. So the gidola mutares, the kutana asura, the large chatzar will be mutar, the small chatzar will be asar, mipnei kepischa shel gidola, because the small chatzar is considered to be the opening of the large chatzar. Beautiful. So the Gemara says as follows. So we'll say, if you look at Rashi, gidola muteres, lahotzi klei abatim sheba im irva liatzma, for the asri Allah b'nei ketana. So we'll say what that means when we say gidola is muteres. We'll say what that means is obviously if you made an erev chatzeros. So if you made an erev chatzeros in the larger chatzar, you could carry from the homes into the larger chatzar. And the fact that it opens up into the smaller chatzar does not negate the enclosure, but instead, again, that opening of that smaller chatzar is considered to be a doorway. Kipis shel gedola, a doorway of the larger chatzar. Good. So I asks the Gemara, simple question I will say. Lamali lemisnei tarti. So I'll say, I don't understand. Why do I need both keys? It's the same case. It's the same case. Just one is a gag and one is a chatzar. What's the takeaway message? The takeaway message is that when you have a smaller area which opens up into a larger area, the larger area is considered to be enclosed. Okay, so in the case of the chatzar, it's because they have actual walls. In the case of the rooftop, it's because of good asik. The larger chatzar is considered to be enclosed because it has the gifufim, right, the partial walls on the fourth side, and as long as the opening is less than 10 amos, you're good to go. The smaller area, by definition, has a full side that is open, so therefore I can't carry inside. But it's the same case. The principle is the same. So why the need to state the same thing, just one with a gag, one with a chatzar? So the Gemara says, L'Rav, katani gag dum yed chatzar. I will say, so Rav's understanding is because the Mishnah is trying to teach me that a gag is like a chatzar. Ma chatzar min kara mechitzta, af gag nami min kara mechitzta. Just like a chatzar has recognizable walls, so to a gag has to have recognizable walls as well. Now I will say, remember again, this is very dramatic because this goes back to what, remember again, I will say, what did Rav say about good asik? Rav said good asik only works where? With recognizable walls. That's why Rav says that I will say in the case of the rooftops, the wall where the small roof and large roof are joined, even though you can say good asik there also, Rav says we don't say good asik. You don't say good asik if this wall is not recognizable. So the fact that the Mishnah compares a gag with a chatzar, just like a chatzar has recognizable walls, so too again a rooftop to apply good asik must also have recognizable walls. Look at Rashi. We'll say af gag, mihi nami disharin aleba mechitzos tachtonos mishum good asik. Even though a rooftop is permitted with its lower walls because of good asik, mihu mechitzos nikaros bo'inon. We'll say according to Rav, good asik only works with recognizable walls. Shalo yehe gag bolei tchutza lahem. Di'ilo minkara lo arminan good asik v'gadol nami aser de'ein lo shum mechitza. V'chol she'ein lo mechitzas ein rushas hayachad. Good Rabbi says, listen to this. Ulu Shmuel. Rabbi say, remember Shmuel disagrees. Shmuel says you can say good asik even with mechitza she'ein nikaros, even with non-recognizable walls. Ulu Shmuel gag dumi de chatzar. The Mishnah is also going to create a comparison between gag and chatzar. How so? Ma chatzar dekadar sila rabim. So it's just like a chatzar ultimately is an area which is traversed by the public. Af gag nami dekadar sila rabim. So we'll say, what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. Shmuel damra filo lo min karamin on gudasik lahachi taninu gabe hadadi. The machatzer the darsi the rabim af gag haydik tani katan aser mishum the darsi rabim mizel ozeh. Mechitza tachtono shebenayim mechitza nidresses v'lo matzis lemegad v'asuka. We'll say, listen to this. So we'll say, I don't understand. If Shmuel says that good asik applies even to a non-recognizable mechitza, then I will say, what should that mean? For the case of the two roofs, what should that mean? What should that mean? That even the smaller roof should be permitted, right? Why? Because let's do the joined wall as extending upwards, and the smaller mechitza, the smaller roof is also enclosed. Oh, so Shmuel Sabo said there's a concept called mechitza nidresses. Mechitza nidresses means a mechitza, a wall or a partition that everybody walks upon. So we'll say mechitza nidresses doesn't have the din of an nidress. So we'll say it's a klal gadol life. It doesn't just apply to mechitzas, it also applies to people. And so we'll say anything that's walked upon is as if it doesn't exist, which is a very important yisod, we'll say. You know, there's a din of being mevater. There's a din sometimes you have to know when to yield and you have to know when to give in, which is a lot of time because most things are not really worth fighting about. But lamaisa, there are some times where a person has to stand their ground. Sometimes a person can't be mevater because ultimately, again, if I become an ish nidresses in everything in life, an ish nidresses, like a mechitza nidresses, doesn't exist. It's not there. So therefore, says Shmuel, ultimately, again, the comparison between gag and chatzar is to teach you just like lagabe a chatzar, a mechinitza and nidresses is not called a mechitza. So to will say, even if you hold of good asik, listen to this very carefully. Even if you hold of good asik by a mechitza she'ena nikeres. So even if you hold that good asik could apply to an unrecognizable wall, which I will say is that joint wall between the large roof and the small roof that only works if people aren't walking over it. But if people are walking over it, then ultimately, again, you can't apply good asik to that. So we'll say, very fascinating. So we'll say, so just so you understand, there's like two very interesting facts over here. First of all, there's the machlokes Rav and Shmuel by good asik, which we already saw earlier, about does good asik apply to mechitza that's not recognizable or not. That's machlokes Rav and Shmuel. And next, that even if you hold that it applies to a mechitza she'ena nikeres, it does not apply to a mechitza nidresses. Very interesting. Good. Yosef Rabbi Rabbi Zera. So we'll say that explains to me why I need both cases. So we'll say essentially the reason I need both gag as well as chatzar is to teach me the comparisons where I learn one out from the other. Good. Yosef Rabbi Rabbi Zera Rabbi Bar Rav Chanan Yosef Abayi Abayi V'Yosef V'Ka'amri Shema Minam Masnisin. We'll see now this is great because what the Gemara is going to do now is that we're going to learn a number of lessons from this entire setup, regarding this large chazer, small chazer. Watch what the Gemara does over here. Shema minam masnisin is great. Diure gidola b'ktana, ve'ein diure ketana b'gidola. So we'll say ultimately again, what we learn over here is as follows. Literally, diure gidola. Now Rashi adds in a very important word over here. Diure gidola moshlan b'ketana. Those who live in the larger chazer essentially take control of the smaller chazer. Umoshchin osan etzla. So we'll say effectively what we see over here happening is the smaller chazer becomes essentially what the Mishnah called. Do you remember the lashon of the Mishnah was? Pischa shel gedola. It becomes like the entranceway, the opening of the larger chazer. So what we see over here is that whenever you have this type of setup, enclosed chatzeros, small chatzar fully open on we'll call it the fourth side to the larger chatzar. As long as the opening is not more than 10 amos or less, smaller chatzar becomes like an entranceway of the larger chatzar. So the Gemara says, the Gemara is going to go through, we'll say, a series of halachic ramifications of this. Watch this. So the Gemara says, Keitzad, Gefanim begidola, if you planted vines, right, grapes, planted a vineyard in the larger chatzar, Asr Lizra Saketana. So we'll say, listen to this, you can't plant greens in the smaller chatzar. So we'll say this is picture 326, right? So we'll say we're talking about klaya kerem, right? It's forbidden mixtures in a vineyard. So if you go ahead and you plant a vineyard in the larger chatzar, you can't go ahead and plant greens in the smaller chatzar. So we'll say why? So why not? Rashi says Asr Lizra Saketana. So Rashi says over here, because we'll say we view the smaller chatzar as being part of the larger chatzar. Now both say that there's going to be a very dramatic halacha over here. The dramatic halacha is that normally with klaya kerem, right? You want to plant vines and then you want to plant greens or wheat. We'll see. Gemara is purposely using the case of greens. We'll see why that is in just a bit. But the idea is normally you could just be marchik dalaramas, just distance yourself dalaramas. Yet in this case of Yirabosa, even if they're more than Dalet Amos away, it doesn't work. Because also what the Gemara is trying to show over here is that the smaller chatzar, mamish becomes like subsumed under the larger chatzar. So because of that, even a distance of more than Dalet Amos is not going to work. Look at that Rashi. Because we view the smaller chatzar as if it's fully in the larger one. Even if you distance the greens more than Dalet Amos from the vine, what the Mishnah did was, the Mishnah created a relationship between the smaller chatzar and the larger chatzar. And what's the relationship? The smaller chatzar is considered to be the entranceway of the larger chatzar. So what the Gemara is showing now is the creation of that relationship has effectively almost like divorces itself from the actual topography or geography and says that we view that smaller chatzar as actually being inside the larger chatzar. So therefore I will say, even if there's much more than Dalet Amos, if you planted vines in the larger chatzar, you can't plant greens in the smaller chatzar. However, ve'im zara, but if you did, so the Gemara says, zarin asurin, ultimately again, the greens will be asur. The greens will be asur. However, Amud Beis, Gifanim Mutarim. But interestingly enough, the vines will be mutter. So the greens will be asur, but the vines will be mutter. I will say now, what's the pshat? How could that be? So this is fascinating. The greens are mutter wairabos. The greens are asur. When the greens grow, they're going to be asur wairabosai. Why? Because it's ki'ilu, they grew in a vineyard. That's klaya kerem. The vines will be mutter. This is wild. It's really wild. Why will the vine? I'm assuming. I wish you didn't have mass. If I would see you smiling ear to ear now. So the vines are mutter, right? Why the vines are mutter? This is wild. Because ultimately the vines have a mechitza. See, you hear what's happening over here? Because the vines are growing in the Gedola, they have a mechitza. Because they have a partition, they're not viewed as growing with the greens. Suppose you have this wild case. The greens are viewed as growing with the vines because the greens are growing in the Chatzar Ketana. The Chatzar Ketana is viewed as being swallowed up by the Chatzar Gedola. That's Klaya Kerem. The vines, which are growing in the Chatzar Gedola, are considered to be partitioned off from the Chatzar Ketana and therefore absolutely permitted. It's wild. So by the way, Rashi says over here, the Rashi, just look at the bottom of Tzadik Beis Amud Aleph. Rashi says Gefanim Mutarim Ta Ein Diure Ketana Moshla Megidola. Because we'll say at the end of the day, that which happens in the small chutzner has absolutely no impact on the large chutzner. Because remember, the large chutzner is halachically mechitzat off. It's walled off. It's pretty incredible. Gefanim Beketana. Conversely, if the vines are growing in the small chutzner, Motel Lizras Hagidola. Interestingly enough, you could go ahead and plant greens in the larger chutzner. Look at Rashi, I will say, this is actually very interesting. So Rashi goes on, there's a little bit of an arichos over here. So Rashi says, if the vines are growing in the small chutzner, you could actually go ahead and plant the greens in the larger chutzner. L'chatchila, delagabe gedola pischa, v'chal pesach kimechitzahu, v'afilu samoch l'gifanim motor l'zras hagedola, l'chatchila kidisnan, haya geder ben saim, zeh somech l'geder mikan, v'zeh somech l'geder mikan, o k'shegad l'azroim, af agav diur gedola b'kitana, in osam esagefanim, daram menachos, ma'aseh bechas. So ultimately, here is where Rashi says that this is why we're dealing a little bit with greens, because we're dealing over here with klaya kerem dirabanan. We're not gonna get into that klaya kerem dirabanan right now. Good. I'll say, but all the point the Gemara is pointing out over here is just understand that this whole relationship between big chutzner, small chutzner, ultimately again goes way beyond simple dinei Shabbos. We'll say, watch this next case, just because the time will go quickly. Listen to this. This is great. Isha begidola veget piktana. Listen to this case. The man is divorcing his wife. I mean, it's not great, but you understand what I mean. The case is interesting. Isha begidola veget pikitana. So we'll say, what happens if the woman is standing in the large chutzner? The man throws the get, and the get lands in the small chutzner. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Miskareshes. She's divorced. Makes sense. Why is she divorced? Because the small chutzner is considered to be subsumed, right, underneath, right by the orkush, subsumed by the large chutzner. So therefore, we'll say, remember again, we'll get to this, but you know this already, because I think everybody learns to learn Gittin sometime over there, lifetime. We know when it comes to Gittin, the halach is you could throw a get to one man could throw a get to his wife as long as it lands in her rishus. So assuming over here that the chutzner gedol is her rishus, if the get lands in the chutzner ketana, that's still okay, because the chutzner ketana is considered to be subsumed underneath the chutzner gedola. Miskareshes, however, isha beketana, the get begedola. But I will say, watch this. If the woman is in the small chutzner, but the get is in the large chutzner, then what? Ina miskareshes. Ultimately, again, she is not miskareshes. And I will say, now look at Rashi. Rashi in miskareshes, the gedola lav basra ketana azla. Because I will say, remember again, you see, I will say, the get has to be in the same rishus as the woman. And you can't say, well, it is, right? At the end of the day, it kind of is, because now, let's just draw the woman in, right? She's in the chatzar ketana. We'll draw her in, ultimately, again. So it doesn't work. Meaning the get has to land in the rishus where she is situated. So the problem now is that if she's standing in the chatzar ketana, then haloch lamaisa, she's in the chatzar ketana. The get's in the chatzar gedola. From the get's perspective, ultimately there's the mechitza between her and the get, and therefore halacha lamaisa it doesn't work. So we'll say, I just want to point out what's happening over here. So what you begin to see is essentially that if you look back, I just don't have time for this, but if you just look back, if you look at the lashon of Rashi, 3 lines up from the bottom, I should have spent just another second on this. I'll do it now. Look at Rashi. So Rashi explains over here that halacha lamaisa, diure gidola moshlin beketana means umoshchin osan etzla. That ultimately, again, it means that halacha lamaisa, when you have diure gidola moshlin beketana, so whatever happens in the chatzar gidola, whatever occurs in the chatzar gidola pulls the chatzar ketana towards it. Conversely, diure ketana moshlin begidola. The chatzar gadol has the ability to pull whatever is happening in the chatzar ketana towards it. What is happening in the chatzar ketana doesn't have the ability to pull the chatzar gedola towards it. And this is true even if the primary actor is in the chatzar ketana. So if the woman is in the chatzar ketana, even though again she is the primary person in this, she doesn't have the ability to pull the get, which is in the chatzar gedola, towards her. So just remember this idea. Chatzar gedola has the ability to pull the chatzar ketana towards it. Chatzar ketana never has the ability to pull the chatzar gedola, even if the primary actor, we'll call it, is in the chatzar ketana. So the Gemara goes right. One more case, and we'll have to stop. Listen to this. This is wild. I'll say, Tzibor begedola. Listen to this. The tzibor, right? The minion is in the large chatzar. Ushliach tzibor bekitana. And the shliach tzibor is standing ultimately again in the kitana. Ultimately again in so we'll say, so what's the pshat? Why would the shliach tzibor be standing in the kitana? Right? So we'll say it's always interesting, right? You see, it's fascinating that you see that, you know, wherever you daven, however it is, it's always interesting how people like have like a tendency like to gravitate out. Right? So you could be indoors, people daven in the periphery. You daven outdoors, you could have a tent that's as large as a football field. People gravitate out. It's just an interesting thing in human nature. How whether it's because they don't want to be confined or whatever it is, people always find a way to like gravitate out of the normative boundaries of things. So here, the tzibur is in the large chutzner. Why the shliach tzibur is in the small chutzner? Who knows? But he's in the small chutzner. So we'll say, so what's the halacha? Now remember, I want to point out, in this case over here, it's not just the pshat about hearing the chazan, not hearing the chazan. Remember, here, they need to be yotze with the chazan, right? The chazan is davening for the shliach, he is the shliach tzibor. So he's being motzi them in tefillah. What's the halacha? Yotzi in dechavasan. They're yotze, right? Why are they yotze, we'll say? Because again, remember, the shliach tzibor is pulled towards them. However, tzibor b'kitana, or shliach tzibor b'gidola. Rabbi will say, but if the tzibor is in the small chatzar, the shliach tzibor is in the large chatzar. So Rabbi will say, in this case over here, ultimately again, ein yotzi yedei chavasan. Halacha l'maisa, they're not yotze. Why are they not yotze? Because l'maisa, again, remember, the large chatzar has the ability to pull towards the small chatzar, but not vice versa. So the Gemara says one more case. Tisha begidola v'yacha b'kitana. Here we go. 9 people standing in the chatzar gedolo. 1 person in the kitana. Mitztarfin. They combine. Tisha b'kitana v'echad b'gidola ein mitztarfin. But ultimately, again, if there are 9 people in the kitana, 1 person in the gidola, ultimately, again, they are not mitztarfin. So we have to stop over here. We'll pick up Emirat Hashem with more of these cases tomorrow. But again, you begin to see this dramatic relationship between the chatzar gidola, the chatzar kitana is not only the Gabi Shabbos,